Hello and greetings from Somerset in southwest England. I'm Edward Lucas from CEPA, which is a Washington-based think tank. And my guest here is Mareike Ohlberg, who is a senior figure in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, but more to the point is the co-author of China's Hidden Hand, the Exposing the Threat to the West, which is a book which has quite justifiably got tremendous reviews in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, as it tells the story of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese party state's attempt to extend its power and influence from inside China, which many of us know about, into countries of the so-called Old West, which may have thought they were immune to this sort of danger. I am not a China expert, but I've been following China very closely, particularly in terms of what it's been doing in the region we used to call Eastern Europe. But Mareike is a real China expert, and I have heard her speak Chinese, but I'm not going to ask you to do that now, Mareike. Instead of which, I'm going to ask you, you must be very pleased the way in which the Chinese Communist Party leadership has helped with the marketing campaign for your book, because it was topical when you were writing it, but it's become even more topical now you've published it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. We certainly, my co-author Clive Hamilton and I, we certainly did not plan it this way. We did not know this was going to be the case, but it is actually true that during the times of COVID-19, basically what has happened, a lot of the behavior that we chronicle, that we outline in the book, that we showcase with our examples, has become more open, in many ways more aggressive, and therefore has been noted by a lot more people than was the case before. So if anything, the last couple of months have really driven the key theses of our book home and have made a lot of people actually notice a lot of, like, as they read the book, they tell me, for instance, oh yeah, I just saw something just like that in the news the other day. So that, in that way, has been, even though obviously the overall circumstances are horrible, it has helped us in getting the book out there.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out that the overall circumstances are horrible, because I think we would all be happy if we didn't have to write about these things, because everything was going fine and there was no danger and no misery and no repression. But you mentioned the many people who are reading the book and are interested in it, and that gives me a chance to welcome those of them who are watching this on the internet, and also the officials of the Ministry of State Security, who will undoubtedly also be watching it because they're paid to do it. Hello, comrades. And we very much welcome people tweeting or sharing their views on social media, but this event is actually pre-recorded, so don't expect us to on in real time. We are not in the same space-time continuum as you are when you're watching it. But I want to just drill down a little bit on the substance of the book, because you look at you start off with the kind of the architecture of the party state's dealings with the outside world, and names that may not be particularly familiar to non-China specialists, such as the United Front Work Department. Just explain to us briefly how the apparatus works within China that is extending its grip into the outside world.
So the whole idea is there's a multitude of party organizations and party government organizations involved in trying to influence how people in Western countries talk about China, to enforce different taboos on China. And one important one that has received a lot of attention because it's played a key role in Australia and New Zealand is indeed the United Front Work Department, which is responsible mainly for getting people outside the party into the fold domestically, but also reaches out to people, Chinese people overseas, to people of Chinese heritage overseas. So they have this key role, and they've been very influential in Australia and New Zealand, where there are large diasporas. But on top of that, there are really a large number of party organizations, such as the International Liaison Department, the External Propaganda Office of the party, involved in this. And the problem is we are, and this is one thing we address in the book, is like a lot of people, especially in Western Europe, are incredibly illiterate about the party and its institutions and about the strategic thinking that the party has. So when the Chinese Communist Party says, well, China is only interested in win-win economic cooperation, a lot of people actually repeat that and the whole strategic thinking that the party has put into how can it actually make the world safer for itself by reshaping alliances, by exporting its own censorship taboos, by making sure that the world plays increasingly by rules set by the Chinese Communist Party. That's just all been ignored. We've been having this engagement strategy and completely ignored that the other side is not a passive player but has its own strategy.
Well, I think it's worth outlining that a bit more, because I think for many people in the West, they sort of vaguely know that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like people discussing Tibet, and they're a bit neurotic about Taiwan, and that there's Tiananmen Square is another sort of taboo. But this idea that there's a systematic attempt to impose Chinese rules and the sort of Chinese discourse constraints in the West still strikes many people as being quite fanciful, quite far-fetched. How on earth can China expect to control what happens in Western universities or Western publishers? But as you outline in the book, that is exactly what's happening.
Yes, and I have to say I was kind of amazed. I left Germany for a couple of years to work abroad, and at the time that I left, I felt like the CCP wasn't terribly successful at exporting those norms. But when I came back in 2015, 2016, a lot of the debates we had on China had changed, and a lot of people were a lot more scared of offending the Chinese government and of offending the Chinese Communist Party. And the way that these things are enforced is basically by threatening people that they might cut off their access to China. And that is across the board, that whether that is companies that either rely on the Chinese market or want to enter the Chinese market, whether that is media, whether that is universities, whether that is individual scholars, whether that is people in think tanks. There's a lot of times there's this leverage that we can cut off your access. And then, of course, the other thing that has worked really well, especially at country level, is to play countries against one another. So when at a time when China really picks on one country, for instance, in the European context, that was Sweden, the idea is not other countries, what they think is not, oh, that's bad, next time it could be us. They think, oh, good thing it's not us, maybe we can profit from this by, making our own deals at this time. And this has worked a lot better than I had just expected a couple of years ago.
And then, so I mean, you've outlined the sticks, and the main stick is, as you say, cutting off access to China, whether it's access for academics, access for companies, anyone else who's got a need to engage in China. But there's also the carrots as well, and you outline the way in which the sort of elite capture at Chinese hands has progressed very sharply, not just in Britain, but in Germany and the United States and other countries. And to me, that was almost more shocking than the Chinese bullying, was the Chinese, what's in effect, bribery.
Yes, the Chinese Communist Party has been has been very successful at building all kinds of networks across the board, elite networks at various levels. So whether that is top politicians or former politicians, whether that is reaching out to all the parties that either are in government or that are in the opposition, they basically do very broad-based networking. Not just at the national level, but also on the local level, basically reaching out to everybody and their grandfather and making sure that they have good relations with some people, that they win friends in all parties and all kinds of groups. And you can argue, and many people do argue, that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with that, and this is just, public diplomacy that any other country would do. My counter argument to that is usually, one, it is done a lot more systematically and a lot more thoroughly, and a lot more resources are poured into that. But even so, fine enough. But the problem is, if you don't understand these networks, you will have even more trouble understanding how then coercion is applied, because usually this happens through some of these networks, and usually that does not happen out in the open, but behind the scenes. So that really is the key here, not just the willingness to make those connections, but then also to use them to exclude certain topics, to exclude certain organizations, countries, speakers, even. And this is why you don't only need to understand the coercive strategies, but you also have to look at the more broad-based elite capture, networking at all different levels in order to gain a better understanding of the scope and of what is actually going on.
So China, since it'd be interesting to know when you think this started, but certainly these efforts have intensified in recent years, and they're now under quite severe test because China suddenly found itself in the eye of the world because of the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or occupied East Turkestan, as they would call it. There's the saber rattling with Taiwan. There's the trade war with the United States. There's the crackdown in Hong Kong. So suddenly, all over the world, people are getting and Huawei, of course, another big issue. So they're getting a lot of pushback from all sorts of different countries. And I wonder, in your assessment, are these links that they've built up paying off, or are they basically, when they come under strain, they prove rather flimsy? Because it's certainly my impression in Britain that quite a lot of these people who were cultivated by China when it was government policy to be friendly to China were quite happy to go along with it. And now that Britain's taking a more hawkish approach, these people are saying, China, China. Well, of course, I had no idea it was so bad, but it's nothing to do with me, and I'm certainly not going to go in and defend the Chinese Communist Party now. So it's almost like the question is, are these, what they've built, are they like sandcastles on the beach that just get washed away when the tide changes, or are they like concrete bunkers that actually make a difference?
That's an interesting question, and I've been thinking about that a lot also because of the UK example. The UK is really interesting because it was really far along in terms of elite capture. It was, in terms of the discourse, the China discourse in the UK, for several years, nobody would challenge the golden era rhetoric of, global Britain needs China to succeed in a post-Brexit world, et cetera, et cetera. Like almost nobody came up and challenged that and was like, what are we actually sacrificing for that? This was consensus. But the fast unraveling of this for me has confirmed something that I've been thinking about a lot, which really is, yes, a lot of these networks they ride on a wave of, right now this rhetoric is popular, and so it's okay for everybody to do this. There's no shame in doing this. And once you actually start pushing back a little more and start scandalizing it, a lot of this will not hold. But what will hold is if there are closer ties with influential people who have, or influential businesses, lobbies that do have either a strong dependence on China or that feel like they have a strong dependence on China. And that will have a more lasting effect. To give an example, and this is why, to some extent, I think we've seen the tide change in Britain, because actually Britain's economic exposure to China is not that high. It's like there's the question of investment, but really there hasn't been all that much investment. So British dependence on China at the current moment is actually not that high. Things have been quite different in Germany. Networking, CCP networking in Germany was not as far, it's building up, but it was not as far along as in Britain. And the discourse was never as far down the road as in Britain. But Germany has been much more reluctant to change its policy. And there are many, many reasons for this, but one of them really is that key sectors of the German industry are actually dependent on the Chinese market, like really dependent.
But it's a mixed picture, isn't it? 'Cause I was Germany business correspondent for The Economist in the 90s. And I remember the wild enthusiasm of all German companies, really, from the big business and Mittelstand, for getting into China. And it's my impression now that many of them are pretty fed up with it. They're fed up with the intellectual property theft. They're fed up with the, the constraints, the fact that Chinese companies can do things in Germany that German companies can't do in China. And I feel that this sort of China, sort of the craze for China has changed quite a bit in chunks of German industry, at least.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And this is a large part of the reason why last year, or beginning of last year, the BDI and an important industry federation in Germany published a paper that was actually quite comparatively hawkish on China. And the problem is actually a lot of small and medium enterprises have arrived at that conclusion. Some other industries have arrived at that conclusion, but there are key industries that I usually say are possibly politically overrepresented in terms of the lobbying power that they have in Germany, that have not, either haven't arrived at that conclusion, or they really don't have that many other choices. Like for the German automotive industry, the Chinese market really in many ways is their only chance. So even if they are fed up with any intellectual property theft, they're still going to take that risk. And I usually argue, and I'm hardly the only person who argues this, that this is actually what prevents a more decisive shift in German policy as a whole, and prevents not only that in German policy, but by extension also has an effect on European policy.
It's an interesting parallel here because if you look at Germany's relation with Russia, the Visegrad countries, or Central Eastern Europe, are considerably more important in terms of trade and investment for Germany than Russia. I think even Poland now is a bigger trading partner, even including energy, than Russia. And yet the German business lobby still is surprisingly sort of over-focused on the importance of the relationship with Russia. And I think this is a subject that deserves some further scrutiny as to exactly why the top heights of German industry are so have such strange geopolitical outlooks.
Absolutely. I'm not an expert in that regard, so I would defer to you on that. But I do think for all these issues, one thing that would definitely help would be more transparency in terms of money flows, lobbying in general, and obviously not just in Germany. That affects a lot of countries. So I do think a lot with lobbying transparency, a lot would actually not be fixed, but it would be a lot harder to. It would be easier. It would make my job certainly a lot easier. So
yes,
that was one of the things.
Yes, to that. So we asked for questions from the potential audience on Twitter. We had a whole bunch, which I don't think we'll get through all of them. But one which is a very good, sharp question is, what does winning look like for Beijing? What's the party state actually regard as a satisfactory outcome? Do they want to control the entire world the way they control their own country, or do they want to have what would the end goal look like for them?
Ideally, of course, it would be great for the Chinese Communist Party, and it would feel a great deal safer if it could impose all the rules it has imposed in China internationally. But ideally, really just like what it wants internationally, just like what it really wants at home, is for people to act automatically in the ways that the party wants them to act, to have internalized the party's norms, the party's interests, the party's rules, and to basically apply them to themselves automatically without the party even having to step out and threaten anyone. So the ideal outcome for the party would be to have that not only in China, where right now the party also doesn't have it completely, obviously. There's still some people who don't do that and who don't go with all the rules, but to have that also internationally, that countries understand these are the CCP's interests, we respect them, we think they're great, we think they are aligned with our interests, and to automatically act in accordance with them without the party even having, anybody in the party even having to pick up the phone and remind people that, this is how you need to vote in this.
So it's kind of
thing. For everyone to have internalized these rules because they are the standard setters and the most dominant standard setting power.
Yes, a sort of vast, sort of global mind control program. And of course, the problem with that, and I want to move on now to kind of what we do about it, the problem with these very sort of maximalist, hegemonic approaches to even the details of discourse in foreign countries is that it's quite vulnerable to resistance. If you say, I want to have total control of this, and even 5% of people don't, then it makes you look much weaker than if you never made that ambition in the first place. So what do you see as the most important elements in pushback against this, the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to project its influence to every corner of the world?
Again, one thing, transparency, I already mentioned. We need to have more transparency at really all levels. Like if they're an MOU at any level, at university level, the standard needs to be, the default needs to be to make it public so that everyone can see the conditions. And if there's anything really sketchy in there, civil society can point that out. The next thing is China literacy. A large problem that we have is we don't know enough about China. And that needs to change because we need to understand things better. Tied to that, I would say actually literacy on autocracies, because one big difference that I notice when I speak in Germany versus when I speak, for instance, in the Baltic states or in the Czech Republic is people may not be literate on China, but they are literate on the threats of autocratic systems. And therefore, they are much more likely to understand what I'm talking about. So this would include literacy on China, but also really literacy on the more oppressive, autocratic, dictatorial aspects of this that are really lacking in Western Europe. It requires codes of conduct for various industries, for various associations in the university, in the think tank sphere, to how to deal with the Chinese Communist Party, where do you draw your own red lines? You don't have to rule out like any contact. Again, I'm not against exchange. I am against this exchange for exchange's sake that goes into this without any strategy and then ends up actually replicating a lot of the stuff that the CCP wants us to do. And then, I mean, obviously, and this is always difficult to achieve, but there really needs to be more coordination and more solidarity among countries on this, both across the Atlantic with like-minded countries, because a key strategy really is to divide and conquer, and that needs to be on everybody's mind, and that needs to be countered much more explicitly and much more vehemently than what has happened at the moment, where the reaction is very scattered.
Well, it's worse than scattered, really, because we see the US administration has gone from being alarmingly soft on China, or at least in the personal relationships between General Secretary Xi Jinping and President Trump, through to a sort of uber hawkish approach, but very much focused on trade and technology, perhaps rather less on human rights. And with the rest of the world not really marching very smoothly alongside that, Australia very much on the American side, Britain moving rather belatedly, but big gap in Europe. So how do you see the sort of the global coalition or lack of coalition on China shaping up? Do you think we're going to continue rowing about Huawei and these things? Will we move towards more focus on the human rights, or will it be some new technological thing like Chinese dance of AI and machine learning that really brings outside attention to a consensus?
So what I usually say on this is, look, the United States right now, even during the early Trump years, this was a lot of back and forth, and I'm still not convinced that, for instance, President Trump is entirely committed to really cracking down on China. I do think some of it, I don't quite see the end game, even though I don't think that's true for large parts of the administration. But the whole thing is, like, right now, the United States, for the sake of it, they need to slow down a bit and think about more strategic measures. What is strategically really important? What is going to take us down a very dangerous road of very fast escalation? Whereas Europe, on the other hand, really needs to speed things up and be on its game and start not just saying that they have, that they do think of China as a strategic rival, among other things, but to really get its act together and act accordingly. You can look in the prospect. It could be a half glass full, a half glass empty kind of person. I am currently reasonably optimistic that even though it's not going to be a perfect cooperation, I do think I see some positive signs of countries in Europe being more on board with some of the stuff. The UK switch on Huawei, some switches in France and Italy. Finally, European countries also waking up to what is happening in Xinjiang. The UK pushing back fairly vehemently against the Hong Kong national security law. So in many ways, I've seen some encouraging signs. What we've seen is not perfect, and I don't want to say this is great and this is the cooperation we've all been waiting for, but I do see some progress there, and I'm just going to take that progress and be happy that this is see the good side for once instead of focusing on what's still missing.
Yeah. And I mean, if we flip that round, there's quite a strong argument, and I think there's even a book coming out called Overreach, which is focused on the idea that Xi Jinping has dumped the hide and bide policy of his predecessor far too soon and far too bluntly, and by attacking on so many different fronts at once, picking fights with so many different countries on so many different things. China's actually creating exactly the sort of global coalition that it has always sought to avoid. And you look around and you see, worries about Chinese presence in the Central Asia, the Indians getting really antsy, Southeast Asian countries worried about the South China Sea, Japan worried, obviously America now fired up, worries about debt diplomacy traps springing up in Latin American and African countries that previously seemed to be quite relaxed about Chinese presence. And then, of course, a storm of indignation about human rights in Europe, Britain worried about Hong Kong, all sorts of countries worried about China in the Arctic. And it must be a pretty daunting picture when seen from Beijing. They've got exactly what they didn't want.
I think it's absolutely, this overreach argument is especially true for the last couple of months. And my reasoning when people ask me why would the Chinese government be so stupid as to pick so many fights at once, usually my answers, obviously I don't know for sure, and I think there are many dynamics going on, but I do think as the Chinese government and as China is absorbing the shock of COVID-19 and the pandemic that ravaged in its own country, including the Chinese economy, they are turning inwards. Because if you feel under threat because your economy is slowing down, and even though the latest numbers they've put out look like there's a great recovery, that's actually misleading. The Chinese economy has taken quite a hit. If you look at one of the key things that legitimized you for decades, slowly slipping away, and this was the case, economic growth was slowing down even before COVID-19. You need alternative sources of legitimacy, and usually what you want to build up in the long term is ideological legitimacy, but in the short term, you're more likely to focus on nationalistic distractions to make sure that your population doesn't turn against you, which again, that's not even unique to the CCP, but I do think this is what's going on in this case. That's the overall dynamic that this economic slowdown due to COVID has created. The party's turning inward, and what other people in other countries are thinking matters a lot less than what the Chinese public is thinking right now.
So that might mean that we gain a breathing space then, and China will turn inwards and focus on political stability, economic recovery, perhaps a further dose of repression, which will be terrible for the people it affects, maybe digesting Hong Kong. But perhaps we will have now a couple of years where we might have a chance to try and get our act together, and as you put it, America to slow down and Europe to speed up.
I think we do have a period where we're more likely for China to overreach, and where that has more of a potential to backfire. Whereas really prior to that, I felt like the CCP overall was being reasonably smart, quote unquote, and only picking a very limited number of enemies, making an example of them, and then scaring everybody off with that, but without actually picking fights with too many countries, too many groups, too many people at the same time. And right now, they are picking fights all over the place.
And of course,
yeah, go ahead.
But I mean, there's a fascinating paradox here that the sort of Chinese main message coming from the Chinese party state is we're fun, we're nice, we're a different civilization, we're not a threat, we have a shared vision for all of humanity, and all we want is cooperation. And then they back that up with these very tough punishments against countries that step out of line. Sweden being told you're like something that got stuck on the shoe, and it's trade sanctions and political sanctions and abductions, and and it's very hard to maintain. You don't need many of those instances before it becomes quite hard to maintain the fiction that all China is interested in is cooperation. And certainly in Britain, the extraordinary threats we've had from the Chinese ambassador about if you dare dump Huawei, you're offending the entire Chinese people and you'll pay the consequences, is very hard to reconcile with the narrative that Huawei is just an independent company owned by its employees. It's not the Chinese government, and you don't need to be scared about China because they wouldn't be nasty to anybody. You can't put that's fire and water. You can't put them side by side, those arguments.
Absolutely. And this is kind of exemplified in what the Chinese ambassador to Sweden said, who said, for our friends, we have fine wine, but for our enemies, we have shotguns. Yeah. And this really exemplifies this friend versus enemy thinking. And everything is nice and peaceful and friendly, and China only wants win-win cooperation as long as you're a friend. But once you overstep the boundaries, you become an enemy. But from the perspective of the CCP, that's really your own fault. So the whole we are very, very peaceful unless someone treads on us. That still holds from their perspective. It's still internally coherent from the CCP's perspective. Of course, it comes across in a very threatening manner, I think, to an increasing.
Yeah. And of course,
this is coming out into the open, and more people are seeing this harsh, nasty side of the party, how it acts when it views you as an enemy.
And let's finish up on this, because you have just trodden on them big time. It's a big book, and you've hit them very hard with it, you and your co-author. And so my final question, have you had the ultimate honor of being denounced in the Chinese party state media, or have they tried so far ignored your book?
I haven't checked in a while, to be honest. I know that the embassy here in Berlin has read it. I know the government in China has read it because they've actually approached German businesses about it and was like to talk about that horrible book. So I know they've read it, they're aware of it. I haven't checked in the media for a while. I don't think they have, because so far I think they're still hoping that maybe it'll blow over, because you do give, once you push back against something and you report on it, you do give it some publicity. That said, I do fully expect to be denounced also in the official Chinese media at some point. So far, it's just been other people, but not the official media. But then again, I also really haven't looked, because honestly, I don't really care.
No, but it is. There's nothing like a good denunciation to improve the sales of a book. I speak from experience here. So we are sadly we're out of time, but I would like to say thank you to all the people who've tuned in on the internet to watch this. What you have to do now is to go out and buy the book if you haven't bought it already, and if you have bought it already, go and buy another copy and give that to your friends or to your local friendly Chinese stooge, because it'll be educative for them as well. We couldn't have Clive Hamilton, your co-author, on this because of the extraordinary time difference, and that's another amazing thing, that you've managed to co-author a book despite being in radically different time zones. He's in Australia, you're in Berlin. But please keep an eye on the SIPA website. We write lots about China, and we'll write even more in future, particularly Chinese influence operations in the Central and East European region. But in the meantime, Mareike, thanks very much indeed for sharing your time and your thoughts with us.
Thanks for having me.